Okay, this is quite possibly the most random stream I've ever done in my life, but I didn't stream today. I took a nap and then I got bored and I wrote an entire presentation on this. So here we are, and now you're all going to learn this, and you're forced to be a captive audience anyway. So this is going to be the most useless lecture you ever heard in your life, but if you ever have an interest in political science, this is actually something that's pretty important if you ever want to learn it. Um, what you're looking at right now is the going to be me teaching you everything I know about the basics of international relations theory. Um, in terms of some disclaimers, one, this is purely educational content and being recorded for YouTube. And two, none of this in content is an endorsement of one theory or another. We're going to talk about that in a second. I aim to describe all aspects of these theories and talk about them in what is the most impartial way possible. My qualifications to talk about this, I have a useless degree from a pretty well-known university in this stuff, and yes, your midterms and finals are cumulative. Failing it means you have to subscribe to me, so if you're watching this on YouTube, there you go. If you have any questions, please toss them in chat. I'll be happy to answer them. And yes, this course is a prerequisite to POG 310, LUL 420, and Pepe 369. Alright? Now, let's begin. To start with understanding international relations as a general concept, we have to understand that international relations really begins at the concept of anarchy. So, if we talk about it in the most simplest way possible, the natural state of all humans in the world is one of anarchy. Government, everything else is sort of a construction that we have made in our minds to sort of describe or to sort of bring order into the world. And this theory can be most well attributed to this old white guy over here. His name is Thomas Hobbes. He wrote this book called The Leviathan, and The Leviathan was actually um, basically a book that explains to you, that was basically a book to explain how governance works and operates. And Thomas Hobbes basically postulates the idea in this book that, well, when humans first start, as like from the moment we're born, humans are not really given an authority above ourselves, which means that when we sort of do things in the world, that means it's basically a state of anarchy. And it's only through basically doing what Thomas Hobbes calls a social contract, by basically giving up all of our rights to anarchy, freedom, to what we call the Leviathan, aka a higher power, is how we sort of solve a state of anarchy, and that's called the social contract, according to Thomas Hobbes. Uh, Also, according to Thomas Hobbes, something to know about him is he was a strong monarchist. He was born during the times of sort of European monarchies, and thus was very much invested in the, monarchical and royal project as a concept. Which is why it's very important to understand that Thomas Hobbes as a state of anarchy is how we're going to start structuring our understanding of the world. Now, before we talk about international relations as a concept, there's one thing we have to understand is that international relations is not a cohesive um, thought. Basically, when it comes to international relations as a concept, I'm sorry, I don't know why it's flickering. This is very weird. Let's see if that fixes it. Okay, when it comes to international relations as a concept, we actually employ what we understand as schools of thoughts to sort of explain it. And I really hope my stream is not flickering, because that's what I see, and it's really freaking annoying. But apparently it seems to be. God damn it. Okay, looks like we'll do it this way. Because this is easier and this doesn't flicker. Anyway, when we understand schools of thought in relation to um like things in international relations, it's rather concepts of ways of thinking about the world and how we order our understandings of, like, how we think about how countries and other actors in the world sort of relate and sort of interact with each other. In particular, this is really important when you think about the ways in which sort of like why does one country go to war with another? Why does another country, get into conflict with another? It's through sort of different theories of thoughts that we can sort of understand how this comes to be, which is why international relations, a lot of people think it's like a very big and sort of broad subject that people sort of learn all about. No, rather it's actually people specialize in different schools and theories of thought to sort of understand how the world is structured in relation to themselves. Now, I'm going to be going through probably what I would consider most of the main strands here, but there are also very many that I'm not going to be going through. But it's going to be important that if you ever want to study international relations in the future, that you probably start very broadly and then eventually focus on one in terms of what you're going to get into. So basically, there are three main strands that I would consider. Though to be the third strand, I would be considering it sort of a multitude of different strands, but I'll sort of block it together for the purpose of this lecture. So the most important strand of international relations that you're going to come across, and what is probably the most dominant paradigm, this is actually a little wrong. Neorealism is the most dominant paradigm now, but realism was the most dominant paradigm, at least in the 1950s, where it emerged after sort of and really sort of gained prominence at the beginning of the Cold War. So realism is a concept, and when we think about these theories and schools of international relations, what's most important to think about them is in relation to how they think about what the actors in the world are. And I don't mean actors like, like actors you see in movies or on a stage. I mean actors in terms of people who have agency or the ability to change things and affect things. When it comes to realism, the only actors we consider are sort of states. And I don't mean states like, you might hear in the US, we have like states like, like Georgia, Alabama, Texas, California, these sorts of states. I mean, states are basically a fancy word that political scientists use for what we call countries. So basically, in terms of international relations, the only actors in the world are states. And what that means is that when it comes to states, the only things that people care about are sort of how states relate to one another. And well, what is the sort of framework by which states relate to one another? It's basically through how power is operated and formed through states. So, for example, when it comes to realism, there are two types of power that, or when it comes to sort of political science and international relations, we consider there's two types of power. One is what we call soft power, and soft power can be, cultural influence, economics, um, sort of the ability to, respect on the international stage. This is what we consider soft power, sort of very intangible sort of power. The other sort of power we consider in international relations is what we call hard power. And it's basically the ability to, I would consider hard power basically the ability to coerce, aka sort of military power. And realism as a dominant paradigm is mostly concerned with this as sort of how it operates and understands the world. In other words, we operate and understand the world in relation to how powerful people are in relation to their militaries. So, for example, realism is really concerned with what we call hegemons. Hegemons are basically a really fancy word for saying the biggest and most powerful person on the playground in the world right now. Um, and what that means is the person with the most military power. Now, I'm not going to name any names, but I'm sure if people think about it very hard, they'll think about maybe one, two, even three countries that we could consider um, hegemonically inclined in the current political era. And those are basically countries that will be hotly debated and hotly contested in many different ways in terms of what we consider hegemons in the world. And remember, hegemon in realism is only concerned with military power. And since we talk about hegemons in relation to military power, and since we live in a post-nuclear, or since we live in a nuclear era, that means the hegemons are naturally going to be countries with the most nuclear powers in the world. Now, now being a hegemon does not necessarily mean being considered a rising hegemon or a hegemon doesn't mean you necessarily have nuclear power. It just means that you have power in general as a concept. And are able to deploy it in such a way that you can coerce people. Now, when it comes to realism, the understanding of realism is that countries they seek power for the sake of seeking power, and that there's not really much sort of nuance to why countries seek power, but rather power is a universal good, and thus countries are going to seek it. Now, that is what was the dominant paradigm for at least I would say up until the collapse of the Soviet Union, where there sort of began to get a little bit more nuance into how this sort of related. Now this is where we come to sort of neorealism, which is where the most dominant paradigm of generally most governments exists today. This is a more contextual version of realism, and this is basically concerned with how countries view security and power. And what I'm going to say about this is that neorealism is about how countries secure power for the sake of security rather than seeking power for the sake of power. And power is like really power is really contextual, but neo-realists would say that the most important thing for a country, especially in a world of anarchy, is that countries will seek power to sustain their security, to sustain themselves. And this is why countries seek power in the first place, because otherwise, if they didn't seek security, then, they would just be invaded or destroyed by another country. This is where a sort of a question of what we call offensive and defensive realists come in. And it's a question of whether or not countries are going to be offensive, in other words, invading or adventurous, as you might understand, to seek power, or if they'll be defensive, to defend themselves security-wise. This is, sort of a big debate in relation to, what countries are offensive and what countries are defensive. But this is sort of a distinction that but my sort of take on this issue is that offensive realists are what we consider classical realists, or the realism I just explained in the slide before, and neorealists are what we would consider defensive realists. In other words, they're concerned with security rather than they're concerned with security. And what people misunderstand about defensive realism is that a defensive realist doesn't always not invade, and an offensive realist doesn't always invade. It's just a question of how their paradigms operate in relation to what they do. So an offensive realist will stay defensive if they don't feel offensive maneuvers are beneficial to them, but they will maintain an offensive paradigm. Defensive realists will invade if it's beneficial to them, but they will not but um, they will remain defensive as their dominant paradigm. And that's what I think a distinction that a lot of people don't understand about realism is. But I digress. Now, a common thing that you might hear in political science is something that we call deterrence theory. And basically, this is a theory to explain why countries just don't start fighting each other. And if you follow international relations, or at least if you listen to the news, you might hear a lot of like people say, we should just go to war with this country, or we should just like do this, whatever. And this is really where a lot of people sort of, I would say, misunderstand relations of, or misunderstand sort of international relations as a concept, and sort of like why it's really important for us to sort of talk about international relations and sort of to a public sphere. And the reason is that a lot of people they sort of get the understanding that, oh, we just need to coerce each other to do things. And, that's sort of true to an extent. So, if you're a big country, you, what we consider have a right to coerce a small country. And the right is basically, the strong will do what they will, and the weak will endure what they must. If you don't know where that comes, that's from the Thucydides, who was a Greek philosopher. And comes from the history of the Peloponnesian War. Would not recommend you read it. It's actually very boring, and also that quote is actually probably misconstrued in many more ways than one. But anyway, deterrence theory basically goes like this: if you are a country and there's another big country, you don't want that big country to invade you or infringe upon your interests. So what do you do? The most important thing that you should do as a country is to basically, So imagine that, or let's use a different analogy. Imagine, you're two siblings, right? You live in the same house, um, and you want your sibling to stop going into your room. So what do? You'll tell your sibling, if you go into my room, I'll I don't know, I'll give you a noogie. Uh, and your sibling is like, all right, I don't want to get noogied, so I won't go into your room. That is basically how deterrence theory operates. The idea is that when we do things in internet, or when countries sort of don't want other countries to do things in international relations, they are going to do what we call setting an established red line, um, establish capabilities, and then prove. So basically, establish red lines, prove capabilities, and then be willing to follow up on those red lines. And what that basically means in a nutshell is they'll set a threat, they'll prove they can do that threat, and they'll execute that threat if necessary. Um, and this is basically the reason why countries don't go to war with one another, and why countries can only do things like, play at the edge of each other's borders, do things like cyber warfare, hybrid warfare, etc. And I understand you won't understand those terms, but basically, hacking, election interference, whatever. The reason why countries only do those things is because those won't activate red lines. So, for example, if, country A were to invade country B, it's very clear that country B can retaliate. But what if, country A just, um, you know, attacks a few of, or, puts economic sanctions on a few of countries B's, companies? Or what if country A, interferes with the election of country B? It's a lot harder to say, oh, we're going to go invade you then, right? We're going to go defend ourselves because you've attacked us, right? Because does this really constitute an attack? So this is how deterrence theory really operates as a concept, and it's really, I guess it's sort of nebulous. It's not really applied, but it's most well understood in the neorealist sphere, and where you're going to see it most often appear. Now, um, oh yeah, I forgot to mention, this is John Mearsheimer. He's a very rather well-known neorealist at the University of Chicago. He writes a lot about China, and frankly, if you see some lectures on him, it's very dry and very boring, and political science is really dry and really boring anyway, but uh, we're still doing this anyway for the memes. Anyway, continuing. So, this is neoliberalism. Neoliberalism can be considered the competing theory to neoliberalism, and I actually forgot to add the slide to liberalism here, but there's actually classical liberalism and neoliberalism. Unfortunately, I'm not really well versed enough to understand the distinction between them, but I will say that neoliberalism is concerned with institutional law. So when we talked about realism as a concept, we basically explained how basically, or how states are the only actors in realist thought. Well, when it comes to neorealism, the only neorealism is concerned with states and states as actors, yes, but international organizations, laws, institutions are all also considered actors under neoliberalism. So basically, things like the IMF, the World Bank, compacts like G20, the UN, the International Court of Justice, things like those are things that neoliberalism will say, okay, these things matter and they have influence in the world stage, and we should consider them in our analysis. Now, one thing I would like to mention is that most people are not considered sort of just neoliberalists or neorealists as a whole, but most people are generally what I would consider sort of a mix. And, they tend to lean towards one side or another, but in general, I wouldn't say most political scientists are, fully neorealists or neoliberalists, except, of course, maybe like the people that I show in these slides. And Hal Brands at Georgetown College, who I would consider is probably a very heavy neorealist, and I would consider him probably one of the most neorealist voices that we have, at least in the United States. But anyway, so this is neoliberalism, the concept concerned with institution and laws. This is Joseph Nye, who I believe is a realist, and also Kenneth Walt, I believe, is also a very well-known liberalist as well. But Joseph Nye was actually the advisor to one of my professors, and I've never actually met him, but I would like to actually at least meet him sometime. So this is a concept that you should know well, and this is whoops. This is called the right to protect. So a lot of neoliberals like to talk about the right to protect, and this is probably one of the things that you should really understand. So a lot of people like to cite the right to protect as something the United States is obligated to do. One, no one is obligated to do anything in the international stage. As you can remember, neoliberalists don't deny that the world is a constant state of anarchy. They just believe that there are more things that have influence over one another than just states. Um, the right to protect is basically a UN compact after the Holocaust that was made to basically say that a state has the right to intervene in genocide. Now, in practice, if we look at history, there has been a lot of genocides, and you'll notice that a lot of countries have not actually intervened in many of them. I'm not going to name any genocides because those are politically controversial, but because I'm trying to stay as impartial as possible in this lecture. But basically, the right to protect is a UN concept that says that a state has the right to intervene in sorts of genocides. And basically, the definition of genocide, which I can't remember off the top of my head, was drafted by in conjunction with what was the Soviet Union, the United States, and a bunch of the victims of the Holocaust, if I remember correctly. And uh, basically, this is what we consider a state's right to intervene on another state's sovereignty. So I'm going to explain the concept of sovereignty here, and it's really important to understand. So states are sovereign, and the definition of sovereignty is really hard to define, but if we consider what is the definition of a state can be defined as an area of territory with sovereignty over its territory. Um, and sovereignty is defined as the ability to govern unilaterally and only in that territory without an influence of a higher power. So, for example, the you know, the states or provinces in other countries are not sovereign because they have an external factor above them. So, for example, there's like French provinces, and, the French provinces aren't sovereign because there's a larger French federal or national government that controls them, right? But if we were to look at France, France is sovereign because France doesn't have anything controlling it. Like, who is the police that controls France? Now, don't actually answer that question, but some names might come to mind, but in general, right, we consider states that have the ability to defend, or states that have the ability to control within their own borders, sovereign, right? And basically, this principle constitutes it's basically a sort of principle of respect among countries, right? States respect other sovereignty because if states did not respect other sovereignty, then that causes problems. And this is once again another reason why people say, oh, we should just like invade or save like other countries. No, it's a lot more difficult than that. If we are willing to invade another country and infringe upon their sovereignty, that means we have implicitly given another state the right to do that to us. So, for example, if I am state A, right, and I do not like what state B is doing, I can invade state B. That is an option. And I can invade them, I can beat them up or whatever, and I can coerce them to do whatever, right? Now, let's change this. What if there's state C who's just as strong as me? And state C hates me, but they don't do anything because they respect my sovereignty. But now that I've invaded state A as state B, I've disrespected the rights of sovereignty and thus have proven that the rights of sovereignty don't exist for me. That means I put myself at risk of getting invaded by another state, right? So there is sort of what I would consider a gentleman's agreement among countries that they don't invade each other as long as the other country does not invade them, and this is the reason. It's the principle of sovereignty, right? Now, the right to protect is basically exceptions that states have given each other where sovereignty doesn't matter. So if we talk about it in relation to the right to protect, it's basically if you are committing genocide, states have the right to intervene. And this is basically a response to Nazi Germany and reactions against the Holocaust, uh, which is why you have the right to intervene in case there's genocide, at least according to the right to protect. Now, in practice, this is a lot more complicated than it seems because, some things don't meet the metric for genocide. Other countries are unwilling to invade, even if there is what would be considered a genocide going on. And there's a lot more political factors that's involved. But this is something that exists and something that people like to cite as a tenet of liberalism. Now, uh, another thing that so the last school of thought that I'm going to talk about, but I really want you to be careful considering this a school of thought, is what I would consider constructivism. Now, constructivism is not really a school of thought. Like we can't really boil down constructivism to sort of something, or to like sort of cohesive schools, because it's actually a bunch of different schools, all bundled into one name. And it's basically generally a catch-all term for sort of, I wouldn't say fringe, but I would consider smaller offshoots of understanding international relations that encapsulates many different disciplines that talk about how the world is structured without understanding it through power. Or at least critiques ways of understanding the world through power. It's hard to explain further without going into the variations, which we're going to actually do. And I'm going to be careful here. Once again, I'm going to put my disclaimer here. This is not an endorsement of any of these theories, nor is this sort of a comprehensive explanation. This is just sort of, a bit of a primer for you to understand what the general aspects of these things are and where they sort of appear out of. So, one of basically I would consider the most easiest to understand theories of international relation, what I would consider feminist theories of international relation. This image is of Laura Schoberg, who's actually what I would consider a feminist scholar, but basically, feminist theories of international relations understand the world as structured on a system of patriarchal control and technical mastery. And what that means is that basically, our world is structured. So if you think about it, most of the leaders of the world are male, and um, a lot of what we can consider power and search of power is sort of concepts that we would associate with masculinity. And that sort of ways and understandings of what might even be considered notions of toxic masculinity control our violent tendencies, right? So, there was a whole debate between the leader of the United States and the past leader of the United States, not the current one, and the leader of North Korea over, threats of a big button. Now, it's not very hard to see why, we would conflate control over nuclear missiles with a big button. But but we can sort of see how, that's an aspect of what we might consider, masculinity creeping into international politics and relations. And that, feminist international or scholars of international relations would say that, these sort of mastery and this sort of technical knowledge is why, um, you know, the world is so violent and structured the way it is. And, uh, there's also an element of sort of technical mastery over language. So in political science, there's a lot of, I mean, I've already showed you a few of them, but there's a lot of sort of technical language in political science, especially in the neo-realist sphere, that a lot of people don't really understand or get, right? And that's part of sort of the frat mentality that political science creates, um, where uh, it's a very small sphere of people, and a lot of them don't really understand, what is going on, right? Which leads a lot of people to speculate, and, sort of curse government officials and such. And feminists would say that, this is part of sort of a frat mentality um, to exclude women to some degree. And yeah, that's basically it. And of course, this is fairly popular. I mean, I don't really know that many prominent authors since it's not what I'm particularly well versed in, nor was my coursework very, uh, you know, in it or very put into it because it's not, as I said, it's mostly a fringe theory. But this is what I at least understand about it. Next is queer international relations. So the woman I believe, yeah, the woman I on the right you see here is a person by the name of Jasper Poir, who is what I would consider one of the more well-known names. Another would be Cynthia Weber at the University of Sussex, who's also really well-known. Um, and queer international relations emerges as a counterpoint to feminist international relations. So first, understand that queerness is a concept of anti-normal. Um, and it's about how so you might understand the word queer as a catch-all word. You might understand queer. Yeah, my headset just died. Apologies. You might understand queer as a catch-all term for sort of the LGBTQ community, but queer in queer theory and queer international relations can be considered as a concept of anti-normal. Because queer people are, anti-heteronormal. And queer international relations really emerged as a counterpoint to, feminist international relations, where queer folks say that, no, anti, the world is not patriarchal, rather it is anti-queer, and that patriarchalness comes from anti-queerness. Um, and queer international relations basically says the world is structured in relation to heteronormativity and states that are not normative or aka queer. And remember, queer doesn't mean like gay or lesbian or trans or whatever. It means like, non-normative. States that are non-normative gets punished by, the normative dominant states. Um, so queer international relations structured the world in relation to normative and non-normative. And that's basically how it's understood, right? And there's also a lot of other strands. There's like understandings of like how drones are queer, terrorists are queer, um how nuclear missiles are actually gay. And it's pretty unique. There's a lot of things to read, and it's pretty all over the place. Jasper Poor is probably one of the most well-known names, though, and I would her book is actually very interesting. And it's sort of something that not a whole lot of people read, and I would recommend that you read it as just sort of an exercise in academic learning, um, not really as sort of something that needs to be understood as um, just another perspective to see. Now, oops. The next theory of thought is a communist theory of international relations. So, start playing the Soviet music here. Um, Basically, communist theories of international relations is exactly what it says on the tin. So, global power politics is structured around class politics. States fight for the acquisition of resources and exploitative practices. And this also explains colonialism as a concept very well. So, basically, the only reason why states fight is because it's economically viable for them and to maintain an economic capitalist order. Now, this theory was very prominent during the Soviet era, and the Soviet and the Maoist governments were actually a lot of their statements actually were very much so versed in this. Now, uh, as you may tell, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, this theory has sort of fallen by the wayside a little, but it's really simple. It's just, states fight for the acquisition of money to maintain a capitalist order, and colonialism was just one aspect of it. We countries invaded other countries for the sake of exploiting their resources and enabling capitalism and wealth. And countries that are wealthier, higher class will abuse and exploit the lower classes. Play Soviet Union anthem here, and that is important to maintaining structures and relations that are unequal and dangerous, or unequal, dangerous, and ultimately really bad. uh, so for our final this I apologize. This picture is really terrible, but I couldn't find a better one. Our last one is critical race theory. Now, this has sort of gotten a bad name in the rep, but or in the media, but I'm gonna explain it here. And once again, this is sort of an impartial explanation of international relations, and not sort of an endorsement of any one theory or another, but just sort of giving anybody who's watching a primer on what international relations is. Now, critical race theory follows the work of black scholars to trace how international relations is structured around a system of whiteness. And the image you see here is Tiffany Lothobo King, who is a fairly well-known author, wrote Black Shoals, which I haven't personally read, but I've heard is quite good analysis. But basically, it's that countries exploit other countries and, maintain their power in relation to whiteness and each other. Um, and basically, what this means is a lot of the most dominant and powerful states are white. And obviously, that's debatable, but at least one of the most powerful states in the world, the most powerful states in the world are generally majority white countries, and some of the most poorer and weaker states in the world are majority black countries. And they would say that this is because of a system and a structure of whiteness. Um, And whiteness is basically the understanding that sort of blackness is something in opposition to whiteness, and that whiteness seeks to eliminate blackness. Now, there's a lot of explanations on why this happens. I'm not going to go into all of them because it's, frankly, it's very, it's very complicated. But just know that this is sort of how it's structured. Now, uh, basically, we've gone through the entirety of my lecture. If anybody has any questions, you're welcome to drop them in the comments and chats, and I'll be happy to answer them. But basically, this was the basics of international relation theory and or international relations theory. And once again, as sort of a catch-all term, this is not an endorsement of any one theory, but sort of this is to help you understand and explain why we have and why things in international relations are the way they are and why it exists as a discipline, right? And international relations is not just qualitative, it's also quantitative. Um, or did I get those mixed up? Whatever. And there's actually a lot of numbers that gets involved with it. And, a lot of people do, sort of just like literature analysis and structural analysis to explain why states do things. And a lot of them also do, sort of statistical analysis to explain why, states are the way they are. Um, and this is why international relations is a really rich and interesting field, and why I think that a lot of people misunderstand it as a concept. And it's very complicated, and I only really touched the surface of international relations in a lot of different ways here. But this is what it's really interesting, and I would think that, especially people who have an interest in military history, they would actually really enjoy international relations because it coincides and explains a lot of military history very well. Um, but otherwise, that is my stream for at least what was supposed to be Thursday, though I guess today is technically Friday already. Thanks for dropping in, and I'll be happy. I'll be posting this VOD on YouTube later, for literally nobody to watch, but there you go. Anyway, thanks for coming in. Love you all.